Hello, everybody. See you guys. I'm gonna give everybody a second to click on the accept the recording thing before we get going.
Good afternoon, Jacob. It's Stephen.
Hey, Stephen. Okay. Maybe wait till we get a couple more and then get going.
Hey, Jacob, this is Jeff from the chamber.
Hey, Jeff.
I just want to let you know I got to leave after about 45 minutes, so I'm going to miss some of the land use discussion, but I'll get caught up and get you some more feedback.
Yeah, no problem at all. Anybody needs to follow up, feel free to do so. All right, so I guess we got about 25 people, looks like, in total. So we can go ahead and get started so we can get out by 4. So this is the 3rd planning team meeting for the Greater Airport Area Regional Center. I'm talking about land use today. We're here till 4 p.m. So go to the next slide. So I'll spare everybody introductions again for the entire team. This is the 3rd one, so I think pretty much everybody's been introduced, but if you haven't, you can feel free to add your name and the organization that you represent or your affiliation in the chat function so everybody can see that. I'm Jacob Howard. We have Kristen here with MIG and Ellie, who's going to help us out later on with the activity, and then we also have Carissa, who is sort of our specialist consultant when it comes to land use. Who's going to be talking to us quite a bit today.
And Jacob, we also have Jay Brinkins with our firm with MIG. He's also on the line.
Okay, great.
Everybody.
All right, next slide. So I just put this in here. I showed this to you guys on the first planning team meeting, but we've set a standing time for these calls, which is 2 to 4 p.m. virtually on Thursdays. So you guys know we have 11 of these meetings. So these are the dates for the full set of planning team meetings as they are now. I've sent out calendar invites to you guys for the next 3. So to planning team number 5. That way I'm going to say that if you don't have a calendar invite, then it's still tentative and it could change, but you know, I'm going to try to keep us 3 meetings out. So when I send the planning summary for this meeting, I'll also send the next planning team invite, which is going to be for the 6th one in February. But you can screenshot this and pencil in those other dates if you want to. Next slide. So this is the agenda for today's meeting. So we're just going to briefly cover the vision and goals again, talk about that. Then we're going to go over the draft focus areas that we've got from the last call and also conversations with the community. Then we're going to have a quick little review of housing and jobs projections for the area. Then we'll talk a lot about land use, what are the categories, how are they used, a draft map that we put together sort of using computer analysis, an overview of the categories, and then hopefully by the hour, by 3 o'clock, we'll switch to an activity, which will be a great place to collect feedback from you guys. We'll be walking through each of the focus areas, looking at land use, which will hopefully be instructive and helpful. So next slide. So this is the draft vision and goals. If you were on the last call, then you saw this one. It hasn't changed at all. We got a lot of feedback on that call. So I would, you know, if you guys have time to look, weren't able to attend that meeting and have time to look in the documents library at the video, you can see that feedback. You can also send me an email with feedback for this. We know it'll change. I'd say get your feedback to me in the next couple of weeks because we're going to be prepping for our second community meeting, which is going to be the first week of November, in which case we will present an updated draft vision and goals to the broader community for comment. But we also wanted to point this out because, you know, we are trying to be principled, and this can be helpful when we're making decisions about land use and where things should go. You can kind of think back to the vision and goals as sort of the big idea here. So next slide. So, like I said, the last call we had, we talked primarily about focus areas with you guys. And so we've come up with a draft set of focus areas for this plan area. It's not set at all, it can change, but this is sort of the next step in that process. So if you're going to go to the next slide. We talked about these things, I think, in the last planning team meeting. We talked about what focus areas are. So, first of all, focus areas are areas for opportunities for direct future investment, support, and improvements. That's to say that they could be areas that we want to develop, but they don't necessarily have to be. They could be areas that need help or preservation. We also said that focus areas have a comprehensive vision statement attached to them, which means that they're really bigger than a single project. And I'll give some examples in the next couple of slides of what a vision statement for a focus area could look like. Not as comprehensive as the vision for the entire plan, but still these are relatively large areas within the focus area, within the plan. So they need to be bigger than just one topic. They may have a transformative project within them. Transformative projects are a lot smaller than the focus area. They might be like one block or a couple blocks or one site. And those are a chance to really talk about sort of potential changes that could support the development or move that focus area in the direction that we would be interested in having it move in. And then we also say, that these will have recommendations and strategies, which are sort of text in the document of the plan that get into specifics of, how these sites should look in the future. So if you want to go to the next slide. So this is just an example of a transformative project in the draft Southeast plan. So we do prepare these sort of visual renderings, if you will. So this is the before. So it's only a couple of blocks of this Hackberry corridor, which is the entire street of Hackberry and the within this plan area, the Southeast plan. And you can see that in that process, they developed this vision statement, which is here on the screen as well. And they talked about neighborhood scale uses, trees, canopies. They talked about neighborhood branding, sort of what future developments they would like to see in the area, building heights, all kinds of things within this vision statement for the entire focus area. So if you go to the next slide, you can see we prepared sort of how the area might look if that vision were sort of implemented within the small site within the bit larger focus area, right? And this is, it says at the top, aspirational illustration. So it should be something that, you guys want to see happen in the area. But yeah, I think, this is really a tool for people who maybe are just kind of skimming through the plan and they need to know what's the big idea for this focus area. That's kind of the idea here. So if you go to the next slide, we have another example of a focus area vision with an illustration of a transformative project. So this is in the Midtown plan, which is adopted. And this is the southern end of San Pedro, closer to downtown. So in that planning process, the community and the team came together and they decided that, this was a great site that, could sort of absorb housing specifically, that they could talk about mixed use in this area, and also kind of, what the street should look like. So if you go to the next slide, you can see an illustration of sort of those things, a visual of those things within this site. But again, this focus area is much larger than these handful of blocks.
Right, and I will add what Jacob said earlier. These graphics and illustrations that he's showing you are part of the focus areas that he will present, because it's kind of the draft areas that came out of the last meeting. And these are intended to be, again, more targeted areas of growth. And then these graphic examples or even kind of the priorities of those focus areas, just in terms of giving you some hierarchy of how everything fits in its context.
Yes, thank you for that. So if you go to the next slide, so these are the 7 draft focus areas that we have right now. We'll be talking about today. So, you know, I think that these reflect the conversations that we had with you guys at the last planning team meeting. They also are areas and sites that can sort of put places where we'll have a chance to address some of the other issues that have come up when conversations with the community. I'll say, you know, 7 is a good number. We don't necessarily have to stick exactly to 7, but I certainly wouldn't want to see probably more than 10. That would sort of get to a place where it's sort of hard to hold these sites in your mind and truly be a focus. But we are flexible on that. You know, these are shown as circles because we don't know the exact boundaries of what they should look like, really. So we're sort of flexible on that as well. And then I'd also say, you know, these are, in terms of focus areas, these are fairly large geographies at this point. But given, you know, sort of development patterns on the ground and kind of our ideas about them, we'll see that, you know, that there's maybe common recommendations and strategies for each of these. So let's see, number 4. So, okay, thank you. Had questions in the chat about what the areas were. So we can go to the next slide. We'll zoom in a little bit more on them so it'll hopefully be clearer. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through these focus areas right here. We'll have a chance to dig in later on in the call. I want to make sure that we have enough time to get into specifics about what we're thinking about for these focus areas later on. But I just want to orient you guys to the sites with a visual, the satellite images, so you can start to think about patterns of development within the areas, and also maybe give a sense for individual sites that would be appropriate for those transformative projects that we showed earlier. And then I also want to say, you know, when we get to the activity, if you guys know specific things are going on in these areas or have conversations with property owners, definitely flag that in the group. You know, I'm not going to pretend like I know everything about every parcel in the area, so definitely bring that stuff up. I would also say, you know, this is a long-term plan, so don't be too, I guess, encumbered by those things. We don't want the plan to be wrong as soon as we write it, but we still, you know, at this point, still early, so I think it's okay to be sort of aspirational right now. So that being said, this is the first draft focus area. Spitters at 281, so it's sort of west of the highway there. I think today, you know, it has a lot of parking lots. It has a lot of streams and creeks that have been buried under parking lots. It's a lot of retail uses, but also a mixture of some like business parks in the area, some entertainment venues, things like that. So go to the next slide. So then this is the second one, which is the other side of 281. This one didn't come up exactly in the call that we had the last planning team meeting, the way that the first one did. But when we were looking at the area, we were kind of wondering, you know, if it's appropriate to stop at 281. So there's some different pattern of development on this side a little bit, but it still is probably accessible by the neighborhoods that are sort of to the east of 281. So we included that one. So you can go to the next slide. So this is number 3. So this is Nacogdoches Road between Loop 410 and Salado Creek. You know, some specific things that came up in this area when we were talking to the community and in past planning team meetings was sort of the design of the road itself at the intersection with 410, and that median was something that I think the representative for Four Soaks brought up. It's also sort of accessible by the creek there, or potentially could be. And there's a sort of already a mixture of uses happening in parts of this, with some commercial, some sort of institutional, like churches in this area, the school, and then some industrial uses. So if this was a potential area that could use some thought. So the next area is Sunset Road. So this is one of the smallest of the focus areas. And we're showing it as a corridor here again. So there's been quite a bit of recent development in this area, but it's sort of got small lots, I guess. A mix of uses, could potentially be a walkable destination, which is something that we talked about in the past. So hopefully that would be one that you guys would be interested in. So next slide. So then we have our fifth area, which is San Pedro at 410, which is definitely a big one, a hot topic, I think, in almost every meeting or with everyone that you talk about with this plan. So this is a large site, but it's an important site for this plan area and also for the city at large. So definitely think this one is deserving of a focus area. So then we can go to the next slide. So number 6. So this sort of continuing just north of San Pedro at 410. We sort of weren't exactly sure where to draw the line on where to stop with San Pedro and 410. You know, this one is sort of on the way to the airport. There's a conversation that we had with VIA in the last meeting about their route, which would go up here. And it also has some of those characteristics that we could talk about addressing, which would get us closer to, you know, thinking about what should happen with parking lots and streams and walkability. There's also a mix of uses in this area today, with some business park, commercial, and then also some residential. So then the next one. So this is west of Blanco. This one came up sort of in the last planning team meeting as a site that people were interested in talking about. You know, Carissa talks a lot about patterns, and this is, I think, a great one to think about. You know, what would the pattern of development look like in this area in the future, and what would be appropriate on this site. I'll also note that this one, and also number 3, which is in Nacogdoches Road, and number 5, have what the city calls a SPIA, which is a severe pedestrian incident area, I believe is what it's called, which means there have been more than one pedestrian fatality in these areas. So that's also something to keep in mind. So you go to the next slide. So those are the draft focus areas. Like I said, they're not set in stone. Hopefully that they're sort of in line with what you guys were expecting, but we'll definitely have a chance later on in the call to think about it a little bit more. I'll pass it off to you, Kristen.
All right, thank you, Jacob. And as Jacob said with the focus areas, he gave a really good overview of what those draft areas are. And just know as we have planning team meetings, including this one and then following ones, those areas could change just based on the feedback and recommendations you all end up having. And so we'll even start to explore that a little bit further as we talk about land use shortly after this section and we have our activity. But even before we get to land use, I just wanted to give you kind of a primer on the housing and job projections within the area, and just wanted to have this information at hand for you before we jump into the land use discussion. And so you have that already at your fingertips and understand kind of the framework that we're working with and what we're trying to capture. So if you can go to the next slide. So the greater airport area is obviously a regional center, and within our regional centers, we have 3 different classifications. And so it's really considered a logistics center in terms of how it's classified as a regional center. Obviously, a big part of that is because of the airport itself, hence the name Greater Airport Area for the entire regional center. And so in terms of growth and how the area is, in full development. You can think of the downtown area as being kind of the most mature and one of the most fully developed areas of the city. And then you can think of on the other end of that spectrum would be maybe something similar to UTSA or even Stone Oak that are seeing a lot of growth, but they are still, kind of in that newer spectrum, newer time frame than the airport or the downtown area. So the greater airport area is kind of just right in the middle, maturity wise. And so these regional centers as a whole really are meant to capture about 15% of the jobs that are going to that we're going to see throughout the next 20 years or so, throughout the 2040 period of our comprehensive plan and this plan itself. So within that time frame, we are looking at having about almost 40,000 new jobs within this area. And just to give you some context, we already have about 82,000 in this area as of 2019. And so that just gives you some understanding that, there's already a lot of growth that is occurring within this area. And we're going to continue to see that as San Antonio develops and, again, continues to be a big target for new industry coming in. And as you can see, just development-wise, the square footage in terms of retail, office, industrial uses has really, a lot of that has been captured within this regional center as well. So on the next slide, I just wanted to give you an understanding also, obviously with employment, there also comes housing growth. And so although the airport area isn't, let's say, on the same spectrum as Stone Oak or another more residential regional center, it does have a certain amount of housing that we're looking to capture, obviously to complement the amount of jobs that will be moving into this area and that will be developed within the area. But overall, currently, as the airport area is predominantly, as you all know, it's more of a renter's market. It has a 61%, about 60% of the residents within the area are renters. And that is, just to give you a comparison, for the city of San Antonio as a whole, that is about 47%. Right. So it's a different type of spectrum that we look at for other regional centers and for the city as a whole. So it's very unique and it's very much employment driven. And so just wanted to give you that understanding of how we are seeing the forecast for this area in terms of the amount of new housing units and then amount of new employment numbers that we will see within this area by 2040. So just keep all of that in mind. And again, we will discuss this more as we get into further planning team meetings. We'll have whole planning team meetings just devoted to housing and economic development. So I promise this won't be the last time we touch on this, but we wanted to give you these factors as we start our land use discussion. So if we go to the next slide, we'll transition it to Carissa so she can kick us off.
Okay, hi everybody. Next slide, please. So I believe it's your last meeting. Oh, by the way, I'm Carissa Cox. I have a firm called Mosaic Planning and Development Services. I'm one of the consultants on the team. This is my first meeting to get to be with all of you for this project. I'll probably be in some of the subsequent meetings in like the next couple. But our focus today is going to be on land use, and that's my focus area for this project. I believe you did an introduction to land use at the last meeting. Just wanted to go over some things briefly with everyone. When we talk about the land use plan, we are going to be speaking about land use, residential, commercial, industrial, parks, open spaces, in a more general sense than particular uses for individual properties. But when we do talk about land use, we're looking at chiefly residential areas, which is where people live, commercial areas where people work and shop, and industrial areas, which is where things are made or distributed. Parks and open spaces is another category, and then government properties as well. Next slide. And land use regulations in our country, land use has been around a long time. for thousands of years, architects have been designing cities. But in the United States, about 100 years ago, with zoning enabling legislation, our country began regulating zoning and subsequently land use. And the whole purpose of the land use plan is to promote the health, safety, and welfare of our communities and to allow the city to manage traffic congestion, to promote public safety, and prevent overcrowding of land. And so the land use plan, it's an important piece of this project because it translates the vision of the community based on the inputs you give us and that the community gives us into land use terms. And we need to make sure that that map is in line with the vision, but also that that map can accommodate the projected growth. So that's the whole reason Kristen shared those numbers with you, is because the land use plan has to accommodate the projected growth for the city. And that's just to help with traffic management, as this says, and to address issues and concerns about safety, and also to prevent overcrowding. Density does not equal overcrowding, but we need to manage growth so that we can serve everyone adequately and provide the best possible quality of life for our community members as we can. So before COVID happened, several years ago, our team started this project. So you were contacted, I'm sure, several years ago, many of you. And there was an existing conditions atlas developed at that time where existing land use was analyzed. We don't create plans in a vacuum. So one of the first things we look at is current uses on the ground today. So that has already been looked at, but that's not what we're really going to be talking about too much today. If you have any questions about that, I'm sure Jacob can direct you to the right place to find that existing conditions atlas. And that's just documentation of the existing conditions of this area. But for the remainder of this meeting, we're going to focus on future land use. And that just means how should land be used in the future moving forward from this point. Next slide. And land use and zoning are very closely related, but they are not the same thing. They're closely related, but they are very different. Whereas zoning is about regulation. It's a regulatory tool that the city uses. It defines the particular rights of use and development that is allowed for a particular property. So each individual property is zoned in a way to define how that property can be developed and what it can be used for. Land use planning, the land use plan is a policy document, and so it guides decisions that the city makes related to development. So your land use plan will guide zoning decisions, but they're not the same thing. And so when we're talking about land use, we're going to be talking in terms of policies and parameters for development and growth. And so the way they read and the content is just very different between the two documents, but they are very much related because your land use plan informs future zoning decisions. And so where zoning is going to be a determinant of rights of use for individual properties, land use is about patterns and relationships among a larger area. And so in a sense, land use is going to look at community values, community priorities, and citywide or area-wide issues, and then how properties in an area generally relate to each other and behave. And then zoning is going to look at individual properties and talk about things of an individual property owner. And so you'll notice in this, we're going to try to steer away from zooming into this parcel over here and why is this red instead of purple and things like that. And that's one of the challenges of land use is we're not zoning. This is not a pre-zoning exercise. This is a land use exercise. So we really are trying to focus on that larger scale of issues. Okay, next slide. And I'll reiterate it again, but this is not a pre-zoning document. We are not, the land use plan does not automatically change the zoning of any property. It does not restrict any existing rights of use, and it can't cause any buildings to be removed or any businesses to be removed. What it does is define how a property could be rezoned in the future, or if a property has not been developed yet and someone comes forward and puts a development proposal forward, it's going to need to conform to this vision for how you see and the community sees this area growing. So the future land use plan will be a guide that'll be used by elected officials and staff and other agencies to determine how that growth needs to happen. And I mentioned it before, it's very important to know that the land use plan has got to ensure that the projected growth can be absorbed in an orderly way throughout the city. This is the first time, I believe, that the city of San Antonio really has had a citywide land use plan. There's been so many attempts over time to do something like this, and the way the city's chosen to do it is area by area. And so that's true, but at the same time, for purposes of equity and order, the same categories are used, the same process is used. And so this map is going to be unique to your area, but it will be using the building blocks that are used throughout the city. And then one of the things this plan will do will be to establish preferred mixtures of uses and density based on your feedback and what we get from the community as what is seen as appropriate for this area. And to serve, because this is a regional center, and to serve the regional, citywide objectives, speaking in economic and quality of life terms that need to be met for key parts of this area as well. Next slide. So this in the middle is an example of a previously adopted plan for another area, just so you can kind of see what the land use plans look like. This was the plan for the Brooks sub area on the south side of town around the old Brooks Army Base. So you can see 37 running through the middle and 410 around the bottom. So every plan, like I said, is going to be different, but the colors are going to be the same, and the way everything gets assigned is going to be the same. It will just be customized for your area. And then once these plans get adopted, they're used by council and by the Planning Commission and the Zoning Commission and staff and other agencies to review future projects and to make decisions related to infrastructure and other factors related to future growth. So you'll end up with a plan kind of like this at the end of the day after we're all finished. Okay, next slide. And the plan is, because the colors are all the same, that means the categories are all the same. So you'll have a land use plan, and it'll be coded out based on all of the city's adopted land use categories. And each of those land use categories provides descriptive language about the types of development that should happen in an area. So about 4 years ago, the city adopted a new set of land use categories. And don't worry about not being able to read them on the middle of the screen. They're really small. You should have received a copy of them, I believe, as a PDF maybe. Yep. So those categories, thanks Jacob, those categories provided brief description of the types of uses and development that should occur in an area. If you look on the right side of the screen in yellow, that first paragraph is descriptive in nature. And so it gives you an idea for the feel of what low density residential should mean. So you can read that to see, okay, when it says low density residential, what does that mean? And then below that is a lot of important information. It tells if I'm the city and someone's coming forward for a rezoning and they're in an area that is yellow low density residential, then they need to be applying for one of these zoning districts. So it's not telling you how to do your property, but it's saying if you want to change what you are now to something different, these are your options if your property is yellow. Now, if your property is purple, you have a different set of options. So it's a menu-based assignment of future rezonings. And it works really well because that ensures continuity in areas and preserves character, preserves neighborhood identity, things like that, but it also affords a higher level of flexibility so that these areas can also be market responsive. And then below the permitted zoning districts, it gives typical density ranges, and that becomes important, as you all know, because residential can be everything from a freestanding home on a large lot up to like a 20-story condo. And so just because it's residential, that really doesn't tell you very much. And so these density ranges help that a little bit, especially for the residential components. And so as you look through your cards, hopefully you've had a chance to skim through those already. The yellow and the light orange, for example, low density residential and urban low density residential. it's helpful to know those permitted zoning districts, and these cards kind of help you to keep those straight in your head, so that you can differentiate between all the different categories. Okay, next slide. This is kind of where we are in the process. This is not the project-wide process by any means. You're doing a lot of other things other than land use. But as far as land use is concerned, we are here talking about a draft map today. Again, these are maps from Brooke, so this is not your area. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how this draft map was developed. After today, after looking at the draft map, this is kind of the point where we really start working on land use as a team. It's an iterative process, meaning that the map you see today is not going to be the final map. We know that. But we need your feedback, and we need inputs, and we need to be testing it back against citywide vision and goals, against the comprehensive plan goals, and then back and forth with you at some of these meetings to hone in, tweak, and make sure that the map is an accurate reflection of the vision and those goals and the expectations for this area. So that's kind of where we're looking to get. And as I said, by the end, we'll have a map that will be adopted. And that's going to be guiding a lot of the policy decisions related to land use and development for this area. Next slide, please. I'm so sorry. Can we go back one slide? Does anyone have any questions at this point, kind of on big picture process stuff? Are we good? And can I know you all know this because we do these meetings all the time on Zoom, but because this group is large and everybody's voice is very important, just a reminder to use your reaction buttons along your bottom bar on your, where it shows everybody's pictures, and at the bottom of your screen where it says reactions, there's a raise your hand button in there. And between Kristen, Ellie, Jacob, and myself, someone will see that hand. Thank you, Dawn. and get on it. So my fear is always to miss some comments and inputs from everyone. So don't forget to use that. Thank you, Tammy. And I'll keep moving forward with that. We are going to stop. I'm not going to be talking at you for an hour at all. We're going to stop in the middle and have some conversations. I'm just trying to give you some context so you'll know how we got to where we're at. Okay, draft land use map. We're going to talk briefly about how the map was built. Next slide. It's the draft map is a computer generated map. It would be highly inappropriate for staff and outside consultants to just sit down and do a design exercise to design your city without any input. So we did not do that. The draft map is basically a way to aggregate and compile and synthesize all previous planning efforts that have been done for your area into one cohesive map. And that includes any existing zoning as well. So the way we did that, so this is a GIS generated map, and we started with any plans that have already been adopted for your area. And this area is great because the whole area has already been planned at some point in the past. There are several of these areas around the city where there have been no previous planning work done. And so their top left map is blank. Like we did one last week where it literally had an X through it because there wasn't a single plan that had already been adopted for their area. So they didn't have any place to start. And so in that sense, this is really good because a lot of thought has been put into this area, and you do have adopted plans covering, it looks like, almost your entire planning area. So that's a huge help. But what that means is that we will be relying solely on those plans at this point. So that map on the right for you is kind of, the colors have been tweaked to make it a prettier map, but it's the exact same as your previous map of previously adopted plans. So the problem with that is some of those plans could be 50, 60 years old and totally outdated and not reflect today's reality or tomorrow's vision. So our challenge is going to be to figure out where we need to go from there and whether those plans still hold or whether we need to see some change. I'll briefly talk about the other maps on the left. For areas that don't have any previously adopted plans in place, then we relied on a citywide planning effort called SA corridors, where they went through key corridors of the city and did some land use determinations in order to ensure that transportation and land use were being planned in a complementary fashion. So that's why it's kind of in bands through the areas. Like you'll notice it comes down, what is that, like the Blanco kind of, no, is that Lock Hill Selma? Looks like maybe Lock Hill Selma, and then 410. So it doesn't cover very much of your area. It's because of that. But because you have previously adopted plans in place, we didn't have to rely on that. So that's kind of background information for us, but it's not something that was a driver or determinant for the draft map you're going to see today. And the other map on your screen there is just the current zoning as it stands. We translated each of these maps to the vernacular of the land use plan. So all those new land use categories, we had to make translation assumptions so that we'd be comparing apples to apples. So, so the colors on that zoning map might not match the color you're used to seeing for your property. That's because we're looking at zoning through the lens of land use. So, but again, that didn't come through on our draft map because we set it so that any previously adopted plans kind of trumped everything else. And because your whole area has already been planned, the map on the right, which is the draft land use map, is really just a straight reflection of your map of previously adopted plans. So our task today and at subsequent meetings is going to be to figure out, okay, so we had these previous plans that were adopted for our areas. Is that still how we feel? Is that still right? Are we missing anything? And development, you know, is kind of organic and it changes over the decades. So as trends change, preferences for how people live change, preferences for office space, look at how multifamily has changed in 50 years, you know, it's just huge. So, so going in and looking at these areas again and making sure that those are still relevant, correct, and where they need to be is going to be the challenge for this group, I think.
Yeah. And
any questions at this point?
Yeah, well, I just also wanted to say, you know, we've had conversations in past planning team meetings already about sort of broaching land use. So this doesn't reflect those conversations. So we know some parts of this will change to address those concerns. So like around like industrial uses and housing and things like that. So we definitely have heard that, and we just wanted to show you guys sort of like the first step in the process before we make those changes. Hopefully that's helpful.
Anybody have any questions? Okay, I'm going to move forward. Next slide, please. Let's go ahead and skip this sequence here. Skip. There we go.
This meeting is being recorded.
All right, thanks, Carissa. Hi, everyone. I'm Ellie. I'm a project manager with MIG. So I'm going to be walking us through the land use categories. I know we already had a question about what the colors on the map mean. So Jacob sent a PDF out to everybody ahead of time. Hopefully you've had a chance to skim it at least, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, since we'll be talking about these categories in our activity following this, just want to make sure everyone understands what they are. So there's 18 different land use categories. These were adopted by City Council in 2018. They really kind of fit into 5 different buckets or crayon boxes like we're using in this graphic. So I'll explain what those are, but really these 18 land use categories are meant to be a tool to implement the vision of the comprehensive plan, also to help the city accommodate the projected housing and job growth in a sustainable form, you know, that prevents sprawl, negative impacts, negative environmental impacts, that sort of thing. So that's really our goal with using this tool today. So the 5 buckets are residential. So this is in yellow, different shades of yellow and orange. These are primarily where people live. We've got 5 different densities of residential, which I'll step through in just a second. Commercial is reds and light pinks. So this is mostly where people work or shop or play, entertainment, different things like that. Again, we've got 3 different scales of intensity for this one. Mixed use, so this is where places to live, work, and play are all co-located and kind of integrated into the same area. For this one, we've got 5 different categories. 3 of them are based on density, and 2 of them are based more on employment and the development pattern of those employment buildings. Then industrial, in pink here at the bottom, we've got 2 scales of industrial, so heavy and light. That's where things are made, produced, stored. We also have agricultural as a type of industrial or production use. And then civic, we've got 2 in this box. So these are government services, publicly on land, parks and open space, that sort of thing. So to take a deeper dive, and if you have your cards printed or in a PDF, feel free to follow along if you can't read the screen, but I'll walk through them pretty quickly so we can get to the activity. These are our 3 lowest categories of density for residential. So first, in light yellow, we have residential estate. So that means the largest lot residential. So 1 house typically on a large estate-sized lot. Then going to our bright yellow here, low density residential. These are still single unit, single family detached homes primarily. The lots are a bit smaller though, more of your typical sort of, I guess, medium or suburban size lot for those homes. And then in light orange at the bottom, we've got urban low density residential. So this is our middle residential category in terms of density. So here you might still have some single unit detached homes, but they're usually on smaller lots closer together, like you can kind of see in this image on the card. We also start to get some more things like townhomes or duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, so a little bit more density and attached single family or multifamily being mixed in. Then the next 2 residential categories. So on the left in our lighter orange is medium density residential. So here's where we start to largely get away from single family detached homes, and we're more looking at medium density apartments and still some of those duplex, triplex, fourplex products. And then high density residential, this is when we get into larger apartment and condo buildings. Sometimes those can be more like up against the street and just in a higher density environment. So moving on to mixed use, here we've got 3 scales of mixed use. Again, this is really where you have all different things happening in one place. So maybe people live there, there's offices, there's stores, maybe there's schools, civic uses, maybe even some light industrial uses all mixed together. So neighborhood mixed use, this is really meant to serve the adjacent neighborhood and be really walkable for people just in typically one neighborhood or so. Urban mixed use, this is a mixed use place that would serve a couple of neighborhoods, so maybe be a little bit larger in scale and density. And then regional mixed use, so we typically find these in regional centers across the city. So this is that highest scale of mixed use place, so really high activity. Something like the Pearl is a good example of this in San Antonio. 2 more mixed use categories. These are the 2 I mentioned have more of an employment focus. So the first one in a light teal, employment flex mixed use. So this is sort of smaller format buildings, small scale office, retail. You might get some fabrication, maker space uses, light industrial, but in an urban form, kind of all mixed densely together. And then you do get some residential in this type of land use as well. Sometimes it's in a live work environment or just kind of mixed in. And then the darker blue is in business innovation mixed use. So this is sort of larger format office, institutional. Often this takes like a campus sort of form. So bigger buildings, bigger footprints, a little bit more spread out, but in a cohesive setting nonetheless. So for commercial, so these are similar in the scale as our mixed use categories, but these are really more focused on retail, office, commercial uses, professional services, that sort of thing. So again, neighborhood commercial serves typically one surrounding neighborhood. Community commercial would serve a couple of neighborhoods or a larger adjacent community. And then regional will really serve maybe the larger metropolitan area or an adjacent community, might have some more destinations that are well known within that area. Things like a shopping center, for example. Industrial, so light industrial and heavy industrial, starting with light in the light purple. So this is really focused on some manufacturing, business parks, storage, warehousing. Sometimes these types of uses are mixed with a bit of a retail component. So people or businesses selling products directly out of a warehouse facility or adjacent retail space. And then heavy industrial is really the more intense industrial use. So things like heavy manufacturing, fabricating, processing, things like auto manufacturing, for example. All right, and then our last three. So in the light blue here, we've got city, state, and federal government. So this is publicly owned land, either owned and operated by federal, state, or city agencies. So things like libraries, police stations, military bases. Parks and open space are, of course, city parks. It also includes larger conservation areas and larger recreational areas like greenways and trails. And then lastly, agricultural. So we're all probably familiar with this. It's any kind of farming, ranching, agribusiness practice. All right, so with that, I'm going to switch over to our activity. Switch my screen. So we've been taking some notes in the background on this digital whiteboard, this mural board. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. So hopefully that explanation was helpful in getting everyone acquainted with the land uses and understanding, what the differences are between them. Just to kind of get everyone connecting with the land uses a little bit more before we look at the map. We want to ask the group a question, which is within this area, within the Greater Airport Regional Center, what land use do you live, work, or spend most of your time in? We know you haven't gotten a good look at the map, so really we're just asking based on your understanding of the land uses. What's your best guess, really, in terms of what land use you spend most of your time in? So to respond, if you have your cards printed, you're welcome to hold them up in front of your camera, and we'll try and vocalize those and capture everyone's feedback. You can also put your land use in the chat or raise your hand and speak up. But we're asking everyone to please choose one land use where you spend most of your time within the Greater Airport area, and then we'll start capturing your feedback on this whiteboard. And if anyone has any questions about the categories, feel free to ask those now as well.
It's like Christina.
I was just going to say that.
Yeah, hi there. I live in the West and Blanco area, and I would think it's neighborhood mixed use
Okay.
or urban mixed use. I don't know. I don't know the difference.
Do you know that area well, Jacob? Maybe you have a sense of.
Well, I was wondering if you could maybe describe sort of.
Yeah. So I love our area. We have at that general intersection, there's an HEB, there's retail, a lot of good like places to eat. There's little pubs, which are not always perfect, but we have great public transit in the area. And then we have some mom and pop stores, little restaurants, taquerias, Chinese food type places. And then we have a lot of apartments and then also we have a lot of residential in the area.
Yeah. So I'd say it kind of sounds like maybe you live in a residential area as opposed to live it like your home would be in more of a residential area, but there are adjacent commercial areas. But how I would conceptualize it for the group.
Sounds like they're kind of closely mixed together with the apartments that you mentioned. I would think the area you're describing to me sounds like it could be urban mixed use, a little bit more dense than neighborhood mixed use.
And just as a tip, guys, when it's, think about like where, and I think what Jacob said is important, like if you live in an actual like neighborhood, but you're right next to something, then you live in a residential area. It's just your residential area is next to some other stuff. And then if you live in, say, an apartment and there's a retail store in your apartment building, then that's sometimes some type of mixed use. Or if you're along a major corridor and you just happen to live in wherever you live is very near that corridor, and there is a lot of transit and you're in a multifamily environment, then sometimes you can consider that mixed use. But if you're living in a neighborhood, then you're living in, just think that's a residential area. Now it can be different. Some of those might be higher density than others, but that's the main way to tell the difference whether you're in a residential area or mixed use neighborhood.
Yeah,
Mixed area, sorry.
Knowing West and Blanco, that's how I would categorize it.
As what?
Yeah.
As a sort of a commercial along the street and at the intersection, but really surrounded by residential areas.
Yes, yes, okay.
And so Ellie, we also have Libby with their hand up, but I'd say we have really good comments coming in on the land use that you most identify with for live, work, or how you spend your time. So you have employment flex use that we've, employment flex mixed use, excuse me, that we put on the board, low density residential, another low density residential, a third low density residential, a fourth, and then we also have a neighborhood mixed use. And I believe someone also said they visit Phil Harberger Park quite often, so maybe a parks and open space as well. And then Tammy lives in a residential that's next to commercial as well, so maybe a similar scenario as Christina.
Yeah. Libby, did you have something you wanted to share?
Yeah, I was going to ask, could you explain the difference between community commercial and neighborhood commercial again? Because I'm torn between the two.
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that the neighborhood commercial is sort of less intense. I don't know if that's how you characterize it, Carissa, but the community commercial would be a little bit, I guess, more intense of a development pattern.
I would say like Blanco would be like community commercial. Neighborhood commercial is like at the entrance to Hidden Forest, you know, if y'all know that area at all. So like that, where it's like your 7-Eleven convenience shop, you might have like a State Farm agent, a nail salon, or a Subway, you know, but it's really a corner store, because neighborhood commercial is all about neighborhood services. So that's, in my mind, that's how I always keep it straight.
So like, for example, everything that's at San Pedro and Rector, that's all regional commercial.
Probably.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, in general, you'll find your major corridors there, because all of these uses are, you know, that when Ellie showed those crayon boxes at the beginning, they're all grouped according to their general use, but then the colors, if you notice, the colors increase in intensity based on the intensity of use. So that's why neighborhood commercial is light pink, and then regional commercial is dark red. Well, that kind of corresponds to our streets as well. So along our corridors, if it's going to be a major corridor like 410, then that's probably going to have mostly regional commercial. It's not always going to be the case, but as a general rule of thumb, like those two should go together, because the higher level of traffic should have the higher capacity system. So that's another kind of good rule of thumb in your head to kind of keep straight of the intensity of the use.
Yeah, and I'll just add that, you know, ideally all of these uses can be more walkable than maybe some places we're experiencing today in this area. But in theory, like the smaller neighborhood commercial, neighborhood mixed use are meant to be especially walkable from that immediate surrounding neighborhood, whereas as it gets larger in scale, sometimes it's a longer walk or longer distance from multiple neighborhoods to get there. So just one more piece on the transportation. All right, I see a couple more coming in. I'm just gonna grab business innovation, mixed use, and community commercial. Somebody chatted me. And then parks and open space. All right, awesome. Thank you guys. Cool. Sounds like we're starting to get a handle on this. That's great. All right, so I'll hand it off to Carissa for our next activity to kind of walk through what land uses you might like to see more of in the area and what there's enough of or what might not be appropriate for Greater Airport.
Thanks, Ellie. So this is kind of a trick question. And so I just want to preface it by saying that everything has its own place in this world. You don't put your plates, in the bathroom, they go in the kitchen. So everything has its place. So what we're going to be talking about, there's some things that don't have any place in this district. They have no business being in the district. In this area, I would argue that's not true, that all of these could probably be in there. But in some of these planning areas, there are certain uses that are not appropriate at all. There's other uses that are appropriate, but in certain places. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time here talking about that, about what we need to see more of. And I'll probably be asking you some clarification questions about that as well. So, and I know these categories are, it's hard to just intuitively know the difference between these words because they can get confusing. If you can think of like a particular use you want to see, but you don't know which category it would fall in, then just tell us that and we can talk about it. So the first question is, which of those uses above there on those crayons do you think you need more of in this area than what you have right now? That's a good point about the stormwater and impervious cover.
This is Libby. I would definitely like to see, more parks and open space. And I think more mixed use would be great as well. We have a lot of kind of commercial space that doesn't really seem to get utilized as well as it could, whether it's, not consistently leased out or they're businesses that don't necessarily serve the immediate community. Kind of have like 9 to 5 business hours, and then there's nothing happening there outside of those times.
Yeah.
Definitely more parks and open space, especially in zone 5, that San Pedro 410 area. There's so much impervious cover there, and there's so much traffic there that, if there was a nice little pocket park or anything like that, it would be such an improvement, like in quality of life for people that visit that area and for those of us who live close to it.
Okay, I love that idea. Yes, definitely to all of that. I'll tell you the challenge, and I think Christina's on the call. Yeah, I see you. Hi, Christina. I know that via the city, lots of us have looked at that opportunities to do something with that San Pedro 410 intersection. And that's always something that everyone's talked about. There's challenges to that site, I mean, obviously, or it would be great and perfect. But to have that on record is something we need to look at and set as a goal for us is a good thing. And I just want to speak quickly to urban agriculture. I'm a chicken owner myself, so like I'm all for it. I'm drinking the Kool-Aid. I love it. Urban agriculture is something that is a use that would not be addressed through this land use plan because it would be a particular use. This is kind of in the technical weeds, but in the zoning code, there's a master table of uses. So urban agriculture would just need to be a line item addition or a line item change to show where it's allowed in what categories. So it's kind of like saying residential. It can be allowed across a lot of different categories. And so if that might be a citywide something we need to make a note about and talk about in here. And if we do, just tell me because that's great. And I'd love to do that. But that wouldn't cleanly fit into any one of these particular categories. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
Yeah, and I think when you say urban agriculture, you mean like community gardens and things like that.
Yeah.
That can definitely be like a recommendation that we have textually. It might kind of
text recommendation.
Yeah, it can, within this document, as opposed to having to think about other regulations. And it can also be kind of a parks and open space type use. If you're talking about like large scale agriculture within a building and, you know, sort of like the more, I guess, futuristic thing, that I would maybe think that would actually lend itself more towards industrial uses, perhaps.
It is. Yeah, it is. And actually, agriculture is an industrial use. So that's why in those groups at the beginning, agriculture is just the lowest impact of the industrial uses. So, so larger scale agricultural activity is an industrial activity. It just happens on, you know, natural land. But that's a good point, Jacob. And that is a good reminder that some of these things like this that don't, it might not be a recommendation or an idea related to a particular category, or it might be not be a change you want to see on the map, but it is a policy type recommendation or a topic you'd like to see addressed in the text. Then tell us that too, just like Jacob just said, because then we can work that into the text of the land use plan as a policy recommendation.
Yeah, and Carissa, I'll just add to that the comment earlier about impervious cover and stormwater liability with more density of uses. I would agree that's certainly a possibility with higher density uses, but it's also the type of thing that you can do small scale interventions throughout a dense area to help capture that stormwater. So that's something we can write in as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in past plans we've talked about streams and park, and we've also talked about our past team meetings, sorry, we talked about streams and parking lots kind of separately, but, you know, development in those areas could be a way to sort of unlock a stream that's buried underneath a parking lot, for instance. So, you know, if it's already buried beneath a parking lot, then it's not going to change if the site doesn't change.
Anyone else have any thoughts about what you'd like to see more? I'm seeing, okay, so Chris clarified for us in the UDC zoning matrix, urban farm is a permitted or specific use allowed in all residential and non-residential districts. So thank you for clarifying that. So that's a good thing, yay. So that answers that question. Does anyone else have any uses that they think they'd like to see more of in this area? I have so far, Kristen, I think you're keeping the tally for us, so tell me what I'm missing. I have neighborhood commercial, medium density residential, employment areas, which I want to talk about a little bit, and then more mixed use and more parks, open spaces. Am I missing anything else?
That's everything I've heard so far. And I see Libby has her hand up as well.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, and I may have missed it when we started talking on this slide, but are we looking at uses for the entire regional area or specific focus areas at once?
The whole area, the whole area. Can we go, maybe, is there a way, is the map anywhere on this mural board? Okay, yay. So that whole area is what we're talking about.
Okay, cool, thank you.
And tell us where too, like if you have an idea of where, like if you think more neighborhood commercial over at Blanco and West Avenue or whatever, you know, so if you think of an area where you think you need more of it, that helps us too.
And Libby, I feel like you're kind of living in our heads as we were planning this meeting out because, yeah, and you're paying attention to the focus areas conversation too. So as Carissa and Ellie kind of showed you on the mural board, the next exercise will get a little bit more targeted into the focus areas, but right now we're just looking for priorities of what you'd like to see. And then obviously the next two questions, what are appropriate or what do we not need more of just for the entire area.
Awesome. Yeah, I will say, you know, kind of connected to the urban agriculture and, you know, parks and open space conversation, what Brian's added in the chat, I think is important. Just trying to figure out whether it's through, you know, parks and open space or urban agriculture initiatives, trying to figure out ways to have some not impervious cover in this area, because there's a lot of space that is paved. Just there's a lot of parking lots that aren't utilized very heavily for some of the commercial areas. And we just have a lot of asphalt in general. So any way that we can kind of build in more green space, whatever that looks like, I think would be great.
Okay, awesome. So flipping that question then, are there any land uses that you think are not appropriate at all? So obviously any that have already been grouped. So of the ones left up at the top, this is meaning like they would not be appropriate to see anywhere in our area.
I'm going to jump in again. This is Libby. I really, because the area is so diverse in its uses already, I think in some of the specific focus areas, if we were to drill down into that, then we could say, hey, no, I don't think heavy industrial makes sense in XYZ. But for the greater, the regional area in general, I think we'd be hard pressed to say that any one of these uses doesn't make sense.
I agree. Yeah, because notice that there's a difference. The top question is which uses are not appropriate. The bottom question is what do we not need more of? So in other words, what do we have enough of already? And those are two very different questions. That's going to help us because remember what I said, part of this is a capacity issue. So if we need to meet employment targets and dwelling unit targets, we have to be able to do that. So knowing what you guys don't like, you think we have way too much of XYZ, that's what that bottom question is for. The top one is what is not an appropriate use for our area. And the bottom one is what do we have too much of?
Yeah, and I think it might be worth pointing out the sort of distinction between heavy industrial and light industrial. This is,
yeah.
In that case, there's a pretty big distinction. Light industrial can allow more of like a maker space or smaller development, whereas heavy industrial is really like, I mean, I think of it as like factories or like cement batching plants and things like that. So I don't know if that's maybe important.
Basically, heavy industry has outdoor activity involved, and there's going to be noise, light, and vibration impacts. On the surrounding uses, they have to have larger footprints, and their environmental impact is usually heavier, and their visual impact is heavier. All of that is heavier. Light industry happens inside of a building usually. And so the impact that those uses typically have deals with like truck traffic, hours of operation, loading of materials, things like that, but it's contained within a building. That's the way I distinguish between them in my head as a general rule of thumb.
There was a comment about need for tire repair places, oil change places. So it kind of sounds like those auto-oriented uses that aren't like a regional destination, but that makes me think of maybe community commercial we don't need more of, if I'm elaborating correctly.
Yeah, I think those uses would be less likely in the mixed use categories, but I don't think that they're necessarily prohibited within the mixed use categories. There would be more tuned towards the strictly commercial uses.
Christina, that is a very good question, and I was trying to reserve. That is my soapbox for this area for residential in general. Because so just everyone knows I grew up in this area, so I went to Coker Elementary School. I love that my roots are in this area. So I've watched it change, over the last 40 some odd years. And there are a lot of apartments, but they're all garden apartments. And so even though you have a lot of apartment complexes, they're very low density. And so it's a challenge because on one hand, you can say, well, we have a lot of apartments, but the multifamily is very low density multifamily. You don't have a lot of high density multifamily. And so Christina, to answer your question, yes, there needs to be more of that. But the challenge is Jacob is so good about always reminding me that you have to deal with fly zones and safety, and there's an airport there. So so there are some constraints that impact building heights and placement that we have to take into consideration. But yes, in answer to your comment, we need more high density residential. That's my opinion.
No, we don't.
Let's see. Any other comments before we flip over and start looking at an actual map?
Yeah, Carissa, I just wanted to note that Gary did think that perhaps we do not need any more. So
Okay.
I didn't want to dismiss his comment. And
Yes.
maybe Gary, if you want to chime in, I don't know.
Thank you, because I didn't see that. Okay. And I think that I am looking forward. I think you'll be talking more about housing at the next planning team meeting, and I'll be a fly on the wall at that one. But it's very important, you know, with those categories you have, pay attention to the zoning districts that are allowed under each category. So medium density residential, look at the zoning that's allowed under medium density residential. Most of those are going to be like 2-story apartment buildings, maybe 3-story, depending on how they're laid out. And your high density residential are going to be mid-rise and high-rise. So if you think about anything that has an elevator in it, that's going to be high density residential. So if they've got, you know, 4 to 6 stories and up, that's high density residential. And anything that's like a 2-story garden apartment building, that's going to be medium density residential. Yeah, so that's helping, because there's these categories, like I said, the words are kind of a little bit arbitrary, and so it's hard to know the difference. But if you look at your cards, it will tell you the zoning districts that are allowed for those categories, and that will help you to figure out, when we say medium, what does that mean? When we say high density, what does that mean? When we say low density, what does that mean? So that I'm hoping that will help a little bit.
Hey, Carissa, I'm going to just vocalize a few more chats, if that's okay.
Sure.
So they're heard. So Marilyn said the problem with high density residential is transportation corridors congestion.
Yeah.
Adrian asked, is big box retail considered regional commercial? I think we don't need any more of that. A lot of empty pavement acreage, very inefficient use of space. And I would say generally, yes, big box retail is most often probably in a regional commercial land use. So we captured that under land uses we don't need more of. I got a chat from Dawn saying not appropriate, heavy industrial is not appropriate. I think that's most of the ones we haven't said yet. Oh, and just now Pamela said we could probably use independent living development, high density residential. And that's all for now.
Awesome.
And I
Any
saw
other
that
thoughts?
Gary responded, I believe it was maybe after your clarification, Krista, on high density and medium density residential. So Gary, if you could just add another chat. I saw you say thanks, but I wasn't sure when it came. And so I just wanted to verify if you have any more comments on your high density residential concerns, or if Carissa was able to address those in her explanation.
Well, it appears that large-scale apartments is a popular move that the city is pushing, frankly. And the area, if you went to Coker, then you might be familiar that the area around Patricia is completely dense with 4-story apartments. They're not 2-story garden units. And these people are by and large, they were transplanted here after Katrina by the state of Louisiana, and they now live in this area and they enjoy this area, but it's filled with high density apartments. It's not a small matter.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think the challenge for because I know what you're talking about, and I saw it, I think the infill has been multifamily. The original development was single family out. That's the way, you know, expansion always goes. So you get neighborhoods built and then infill comes in as multifamily. And it's been a point of tension for this area. And so that's just an area, and I feel like it's a topic of tension that this planning team is going to have to responsibly address, because I'm glad that you said that, because it is a concern of this area. I would love it if we could talk about where we could provide some of that instead of just globally saying more of this, yes to this, no to this. But Libby, I believe you said that earlier as well, is maybe we look at where in this larger area that would be appropriate. Because if we don't do that, then we're having to make a global statement about whether that's good or bad. Because my whole point is just more garden apartments isn't going to solve the problem, because you'll never get your numbers that way, and you'll get what you're talking about. So I'm hoping, I'm hoping that once we get into the map, we can say, okay, because we've got to meet our projections. So if we've got to meet our projections of absorption of projected house, residential growth and providing housing, how can we do that in a way that is respectful of these longstanding existing neighborhoods, and what you said is true, but at the same time meets those needs of the city overall, which is to absorb in this regional center a certain target for residential growth by providing dwelling units. So there's a math side of this. So the mapping exercise is to figure out where to accommodate that in a way that is appropriate. So you are definitely heard. I remember all the neighborhood meetings when some of those projects first came in back in the 80s. So, and that is a voice that is true. And a lot of people that live in that area feel that same way. So thank you for saying that.
Could I also add that there's a 4-story subsidized apartment project next to the Sam's that fronts on 281. It's ironic that you said we had the airport to deal with, and yet it's right in the flight path, and it was approved. And I think that's part of the city's goal, to put subsidized housing out in the suburbs. And I'd like that to be governed and not just wide scale.
Can I ask just real fast, just for clarification, do you mean the old Sam's or the new Sam's up at Marshall? Like the old Sam's at Bitters or the new Sam's?
It's at Inner Park and 281.
Yeah, it was like Burlington for a while there or whatever.
No, it was a Sam.
Yeah, I got you. Okay. And that's, well, if it's okay with you, Gary, I'm going to flag that as one of our big team challenges that our team will take on. And team, I mean all of us, like the planning team and the consultants and staff. I think we should address this area. And let's look at the map, because when you brought up Inner Park, I think that's a good time to transition over to that. And we'll start looking at problem areas and where we're off and where we're not with the map, if that's okay.
I echo what Carissa was saying. This is a very large area, so we're definitely not targeting any of these specific focus areas for housing per se, but we just want to make sure that we get development patterns within the focus areas correct, so that we're avoiding these conflicts in the future. So that's sort of the opportunity that we can have when we talk specifically about focus areas within this plan. So hopefully this will allay some of those concerns.
Jacob, if I may add, this is Christina. I did add a comment in the chat. I live right in that area near Patricia. And one of the benefits that I see about the residential usage there is there are a lot of people that utilize those apartments, but they walk to HEB, they walk to school, they walk to the restaurants, they walk to public transit. They may not all have cars, I understand that, but I like seeing people on the sidewalks utilizing, the area. They walk to the park, they walk to the gym. We have a Marshall's and a Ross nearby. I love that we actually see humans rather than just cars in the area. So that's just my opinion.
Okay. Thank you.
So let's look at, anyone else have any comments before we kind of jump into the map a little bit?
Just a few from the chat. This is just reiterating what Christina just said, but she said, what's nice about apartment dwellers on Patricia, several people walk to HEB and schools and transit versus driving. Pamela said, congestion is solved by public transit. Car-centric culture is not sustainable. And then Marco said, Christina, very good point. They walk everywhere. Great point. And then Gary said, pedestrians have been killed crossing Blanco Road.
Yeah, So Blanco, and I had some questions for y'all because again, you'll have to bear with me because you've probably already wrestled through all of this, but because I wasn't in the last planning team meeting, there are a lot of corridors in this area that it's not major highway, but they're key corridors where people live and spend a lot of our time, and they're important to us, you know, as members of the community. And so it was interesting that Blanco and Jones Maltzberger didn't show up, and then someone in this thing brought up Thousand Oaks, and so we're not treating corridors any differently than focus areas, and y'all have already talked about that. So that's why you noticed that Nacogdoches and Sunset, you know, I think y'all flagged that in your last meeting. But if there are certain corridors that we need to be talking about, this is a good time to do that too. Well, I think maybe, and Ellie and Kristen, tell me what you think, but I'd like to spend some time talking about the elephant in the room, which is a multifamily issue out here at some point, and let's look at maybe where that's appropriate on the map and where it's not. It's interesting because if you look at the map, there is a lot of land from a percentage perspective compared to a standard for any city in the country. There's a high percentage of land that is designated as park open space, but I'll tell you, I think the reason it seems like there's not a lot of it is because they aren't neighborhood parks, and they're not smaller parks that are adjacent to residential areas. You know, McAllister, I mean, to me, Phil Harburger and McAllister are two of the most attended. Everyone uses those parks. You know, they serve this whole city, and they're in your planning area. So as far as park assets go, you have two of the best in the city in your area, but they're regional scale, they're big. They don't serve the surrounding neighborhoods. And so when we talk about more park and open space, that's another thing we might need to talk about. Okay, so when we say that, from a regional parks perspective, you actually are good. You've got two amazing parks in your one area. But if you look at the neighborhoods, there's not a lot of pocket parks, neighborhood parks, places kids can walk and ride their bikes, go play, and that kind of stuff. So maybe we start with park open space and then transition over into residential. Is that okay?
And Carissa, I'd say too, I just want to kind of tee up some, or maybe even tease some of the activity from the upcoming meetings. But next time, since we'll be focusing on housing economic development, we'll have kind of an allocation activity as well, of looking at the whole area and specifically looking at different types of residential uses and where they're appropriate and where they'll go to meet those projections that we presented earlier. And so, so we'll talk through that. And, you know, so as Carissa was saying, you know, she was talking about the parks and open space, and that was listed as kind of one of our priority land uses. So it'd be great to kind of build off of the priorities that you all identified and really find out where those are more appropriate. And I know Libby said she had some concerns even with this, the great access to all these wonderful parks, but the issue is that they're all regional in scale. So they don't have very many parks within a 10-minute walking distance. So maybe more pocket parks or community parks or neighborhood parks that could be within the area. So that's a great point, Libby. Do you have any ideas, looking at this map and even looking at the focus areas we talked about earlier, of where those parks could be allocated?
Can we go ahead and maybe try to zoom in on the focus areas? Because we just have the 30 minutes left here.
Jacob, bear with me a little bit. We're going to get there. I promise. It's just I want to get these two issues kind of put to bed that are the big ones that everyone brought up, but we will do that. Okay. But thank you for bringing up the time reminder. I appreciate that. So that was in the spirit of being stewards of everybody's time, just to let everyone know, we really only have 20 minutes to look at this map. So what would be a good thing, and Kristen, your reminder that we get to talk more about housing at the next meeting. So maybe we can leave that a little bit till PT4. And I know we'll revisit park open space. Don't we do that at a later PT meeting as well?
Yes.
Right. We'll get to talk about that later on too.
Okay. So since we have 20 minutes, my biggest question for everyone, because we're not going if we just look at focus areas, we're not going to be able to talk about Blanco, West Avenue, Jones Maltsberger, Bitters, or Thousand Oaks. And, yeah. So if everyone, maybe we can just take a skim look at that. And if y'all want to just let me know any thoughts you have about those roads and how the land use kind of looks along them or how it should, or any thoughts you have about any of those other kind of, they're not major thoroughfares, but they are kind of major neighborhood connector streets in your area. Someone brought up Thousand Oaks earlier.
I would say,
Like,
I mean, sorry, this is Libby. I was gonna say, I mean, the biggest kind of theme for all of those streets is that the pedestrian infrastructure is not good. I mean, they're really not safe areas for people to be walking, despite the fact that they're kind of the main thoroughfares where a lot of the services exist.
Yeah,
that's kind of my biggest piece of feedback there.
Okay. What about the areas? And the other things, remember, we said focus areas are about areas that have the highest potential for change or opportunity. And so one of the areas y'all didn't flag, but I wanted to ask you about is the area west of Interpark, between Interpark and Westbrook Parkway. I think, Gary, you mentioned some apartments going in around that area. Up in there, I think like there's a FedEx distribution center, and it's like TechFlex industrial office spaces off of Interpark back up in there. But I don't know, it's showing up a lot of that as green right now just because it's a floodplain.
I know you want to address Interpark, but you did mention the Thousand Oaks, and I had brought up Thousand Oaks, and there is some development talk, and I think that those are a go on Thousand Oaks as far as the other side of Thousand Oaks, as far as multi-development housing units that are going to go in along there. So the Thousand Oaks really does need to be addressed, in my opinion, and especially down in that area of Jones Maltsberger and really all along there, from Wetmore to Jones Maltsberger. The area is aged, and the outside of Thousand Oaks is developing, and we really can't let that go. And it is the entire backside of the airport area. As well as the park area, and that whole Salito Creek area through there is going to be developed. So.
Okay. I agree. Okay, good call. So maybe take a close, I know we only captured part of that intersection, but let's look at the Thousand Oaks Jones Maltsberger intersection as well. And that is neighborhood retail in there. Like, you look at just how porous it is with the surrounding neighborhoods, and those are neighborhoods, everyone eats at the restaurants, you know, I mean, forever, you know, that kind of stuff. So, okay. Any other major kind of corridor or area that's outside of the focus areas that we flagged? And we'll come back to this map at PP5 again and talk about that more. So let's jump in then to Bitters and 281. Can someone walk me through why these are two separate areas? And I mean, I have my, but I just want to kind of catch up with your logic and what y'all think about each of them separately. I see them as separate, but I want to see what everybody else kind of thinks.
Well, so in the last meeting, you know, focus area number 1, which is west of 281, came up specifically. So then following that conversation internally, we had a discussion about whether or not 2 would make sense as an additional focus area, which is a kind of a question to the planning team rather than having come from the planning team.
Oh, okay, I get it. Because if it's a stable area that's high performing, that serves your neighborhoods where nothing needs to change, then just tell us that. But if it's not high performing, it's not stable, it's kind of gotten run down over time, or it needs to be better, or it's undeveloped, then those are the areas we need to really look at.
Well, I'll just ask a question here. I know that, we see a lot of, I think it's regional and community commercial in these two areas on the map, and there was a lot of talk about mixed use. So I guess I'm curious if anyone thinks that this would be a good location to transform from just commercial to mixed use, and if so, maybe like what scale of those mixed use categories might work best.
This is Libby. To kind of answer the question about why these are two separate focus areas, I think that the only and obvious answer is that there's a giant highway that goes through the middle of them, and it's really not, you don't really see people going to services in both focus areas. It's like people kind of go to one or the other. You're either going to get off the freeway and go to one, or you're going to get off the freeway and go to two, or if you're in the neighborhood behind two, you use those services. If you're in the neighborhood behind one, you use those services. I mean, as far as like multimodal options, I mean, crossing under that freeway is not pleasant in any way, shape, or form. And then, I mean, I think, yeah, there are good opportunities for some kind of mixed use. I would need to have the categories pulled up in front of me to say which, but there's already a lot of residential kind of surrounding them. So mixed use residential, I think, would be great. So that there are people who can get to these services without having to drive their cars.
And I wonder, I think that part of, Gary, I know that part of the tension about that, especially along Heimer, was there was an unwillingness to have multifamily in there. And it came in, so there is multifamily there now that supports that retail. But as far as either infill or redevelopment as a mixed use project, that's kind of why I brought up the Inner Park area. But again, you might get into challenges because of airport zone restrictions. But the two areas are high performers, and I'm sure Matt will talk about that in next week's or your next planning team meetings. But if you have an area that's high performing retail, and it has a definite population it's serving, as you mentioned, Libby, then there might not be huge opportunities for change. I will say, however, that pad sites are always, I mean, it's like, look right there at the southeast corner down there by, I think it's like an Office Depot and the dollar store and all that. They're just now, for 40 years putting in pad sites out there along the frontage road. So there's always room to add more stuff to a site. It's just making sure that you're accommodating the stuff you want to see. And I'll also make a note that changing something to mixed use designation, it's a trick. It does open the door to residential. So if there's a place where you don't feel residential is going to be important, you do technically open a door of opportunity to that. But what it does is it allows areas to be more responsive to market trends and market demand, because you're providing a wider range of allowable uses and allowable zoning categories. So as long as there's not like an opposition to multifamily being in an area, then mixed use is going to be a good designation because you're providing more flexibility. So just kind of keep that in mind too, as we're talking about these areas of the map.
And on the note of mixed use, one thing we can consider too is transition. So like the whole focus area doesn't need to be one color. It could be regional mixed use farther away from the neighborhood, and it scales down towards the neighborhood as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so any other thoughts or comments about the Bitters and 281 intersection? Okay, what is our area number 3? Let's leave the corridors and just go to the areas for now. So let's skip Nacogdoches and skip Sunset and just look at 5, 6, and 7. Yeah. Oh my goodness. So can those of you guys who've been around, do y'all remember back in the 70s when that water park used to be at the intersection of San Pedro and the new McAllister Freeway? There's like a horrible accident, but I don't think, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, but that area hasn't changed since then. Like it's been the same since the 70s. And it just needs a lot of help. So Jacob, did y'all talk about that the top part of the triangle? I think it's employment flex right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely heard a lot of conversations about 5 foremost, and you guys can jump in if feel like that's a mischaracterization. I think that people are seeing it as a real challenge for connection through from the north to the south. And also I'd say what I've heard is just, the amount of asphalt and sort of unactivated space in the area is, not, people are not happy with that. And also there's concerns about crime in this area. So those would be things that we would want to address.
Would this be a place where, and I'm not sure if we have any airport folks on the team, and Christina, you'll be a good person to speak to this too, but would this area be a place where we could do some mixed use designations that allow for any type of residential? Like urban or regional mixed use?
I think we do have somebody on from the airport, I thought.
Yeah, well, I think the airport. So this is not I don't think that this site is necessarily inhibited by the airport in the way that other areas are for residential. So there's some chance.
Okay. Oh, because it's not the flyover area.
But I mean, it's definitely a factor we have to consider.
This is
Just
Libby.
because there are. Oh yeah.
For this area, to answer your question, Carissa, I think yes, it could be a good potential fit for mixed use that includes residential. It would be a large undertaking because, I mean, you'd have to tear up a lot of the paved surface area, but it could be really cool in this area to have some kind of residential mixed use that has green space built into it that's not necessarily public green space. Maybe it's private, but it's kind of that fluid public-private green space where folks who are visiting the area can still enjoy that. If it was designed correctly and it provided, good quality of life, I think people would be really excited to live in this area because it is so close to so many services. And if you're not purchasing a home, there aren't a lot of opportunities to live near this center, even though so many people come here for services. So doing something like that could be a good fit, especially if it was, affordably priced or anything close to affordably priced. I think plenty of folks would be happy to be that close to the airport.
And I think, Christina, correct me if I'm wrong, but that would, okay, so some of these sites, you can tell by how small the parcels are that you couldn't do something like that on these because land assembly would just knock that out. But you do have some older apartments up in there. So, I mean, it's not like in the northern part between Ramsey and Isom, there's those old apartments in there. So it's not an impossible vision, all that to say. But I would think too that making this area available or able to be some type of mixed use would probably fit with y'all's objectives for VIA as well, right?
Absolutely. I think, the objective of VIA is really to be a service that's utilized by our community, right? So if we have a high frequency, awesome service on the San Pedro area, we want as many customers or as many taxpayers, right, to be able to utilize that service. So it makes perfect sense that there would be an opportunity, that there would be some high residential high density residential in this area. That would be phenomenal. That old Central Park mall area with now there's a Target and there's a kind of theater and stuff like that. I mean, I could definitely see like a residential tower kind of.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Because that's contextually appropriate. Yes. Okay.
Right.
Cool. And also one of the oh, go ahead. I'm so sorry.
No. It could be like a cool pearl or something like that. I mean, it really could be some awesome space. Right now, there's just a lot of pavement and boxes and stuff. But I definitely think that we should call out some high density residential in this area for sure.
Okay. And I also like it because among all the staff and consultants, we've talked about this. It's a real challenge because there's a donut of commercial surrounding a very old and established and good residential neighborhood right in the middle of this area. And it's just a problem on so many levels. And so again, the idea of transitioning to provide some buffers so that neighborhood doesn't just have high density commercial making this big donut and industrial around them would be a good planning approach, so that you are transitioning out and that you're bringing other residential in there, so it's not all just industrial and commercial. Okay, let's move on because we're running out of time. So the North Star Mall area, Christina, that was a good segue. So that is another area where I'm hearing that might be better to do maybe some of this as a high density mixed use, so we could get some, oh, sorry, no, up at number 4. Or the 281 and number 1. Sorry, number 1. Yeah. Wait, I'm so sorry. I'm off on my map. Back to where we were. Keep going down. Not that one. Yes, number 5. There we go. So are we also saying for this area, how would you guys feel about making more of this area like regional mixed use instead of just regional commercial? Or would that be a problem?
I think that would be a great fit.
Mixed use introduces residential. Okay.
Now this is probably like, I don't know if this is a pipe dream, but I feel like there's also a good opportunity in this area for businesses that are, strictly commercial to build in some kind of public-private green space, whether, if it's an office building or something like that. I mean, when AT&T left San Antonio and went to Dallas, they built a beautiful public-private space to tie together their little downtown campus. Now, I'm not saying that that's something that necessarily would happen here, but it's a great example. AT&T Discovery Green in Dallas. I mean, it's a city block, but the way that the public utilizes it is amazing. So,
yeah. Okay, and basically then introducing more green space through site planning and not necessarily just saying this 10 acres needs to be zoned as a park, but making sure that the site plans call for a little more green infrastructure and a little less pavement. Is that right?
Yeah, 100%. Because I understand, I would love to see a public park, pocket park, whatever, go in here, but realistically, I don't know if that's really going to happen. So incentivizing whatever development does go in here, whether it's regional mixed use or commercial or other things, to have green space built into their actual site, could be huge just for the area and for people who use it.
Okay, last site, I think is it Blanco and 410 or what's number? No, West Avenue and Blanco, right? So northwest of where we're at now, number 7, yeah. So this is, I mean, what an area for opportunity. I mean, it's a challenging area. Like if it were easy, it would be different, right? But I think for this planning team and for this group, this is a real area of opportunity to talk about what could be, because this area serves the surrounding neighborhoods. I mean, y'all know that. So to me, the question then is, how can this area better serve the surrounding neighborhoods? So I don't know if we need to limit, we could talk about this for an hour, but maybe if we can try to limit to very brief conversation, very brief comments, and try to get this wrapped up in maybe about 4 or 5 minutes, which is going to be hard. Thank you, Pamela. Is there any, oh, go ahead.
And
is everyone okay with just saying residential?
Sorry, Chris, I was going to say Pamela's comment was there's a residential tower near Target. And so that one burned down a few years ago and it's reopened now. believe that, it's almost fully occupied over there, and renovated. So thank you for pointing that out. Just want to also say that we got some other comments about kind of the utilization of some space at Bitters and 281, and how there's about an increase of 35% unoccupied space in there. And then some interest in maybe some revitalization in certain areas and some pad sites that have been called out. Also, a note that the Luby's at 281 and Bitters had closed down. So someone's in favor of a potential bar or poker club at that location. So I just wanted to let you all know.
Oh, okay. So we're back. Okay. I thought you were talking about this area. I was lost. So are there any other comments on this? Because we're running out of time. Are there any other thoughts? I got, Christina, I got yours about the intersection there. And the city does kind of promote transit-oriented development, but we also want to support transit-supportive land use. So if there is an area that's going to be a service area for transit, we want to make sure that the land uses around that area are complementary to that. So that's something we're going to look at as we move forward. Right now, the whole intersection, you can tell, is a mixture between regional commercial and community commercial, and the community commercial is a step down from that as it approaches Harmony Hills. So I don't know if we need more differentiation for those uses down to any opportunities for neighborhood commercial along West Avenue, because that's what those shops are, like the old soccer shop that used to be there and Little Italy and all of that. So much of the West Avenue commercial activity serves the immediate neighborhood. So I don't know, I know we're running out of time, but if you guys have any thoughts or opinions on that, this would be a good time to let us know.
So this is Libby. I'll say I really only pass through this area when I'm biking. I bike up and down Blanco quite a bit. So this is not a focus area where I go for services necessarily, but the thing that strikes me about it, and one of the reasons why I don't spend more time there, is because it's all corporate chain businesses. There really aren't any independent local small businesses there. So it's like, based on what's available in some of the other parts of this regional center, it's I don't know, it's just not really, doesn't attract me to go spend money there, I guess. And it's also just not a very hospitable or welcoming kind of area at any of those corners of the intersection. It's kind of hard to access if you're not in a car. And I don't know if that helps you in any way, shape, or form, but that's my.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, for sure. So there's I'm trying to think. If you see, I'm losing, what's the name of the road that's just west of Blanco off of West Avenue? It's the Backer Road to all the apartments up in there.
Braesview, I think.
Patricia.
Yeah. Braesview. Thank you.
Braesview and Patricia. Yeah. Changes names.
Yes. Okay. So up in there, you know, there's a lot of apartments in that area, and they've been there a very, very, very long time. But I feel like this area, and y'all tell me, but is this relatively stable, and does it need to stay the way it is now? Or could you see that where that hooks up with Northwest Military? Does that area need to be like Braesview, that whole area in there? I don't see that changing very much, but I don't know. I wanted your opinion.
So that Walmart backs up to, like you mentioned, Westbrook Parkway, which is, there's the land bridge opportunity and to getting into Hardburger Park. So there is a lot more bicycle activity in and around that area. Which is weird because Walmart's right there and Westbrook, but it's an awesome weird. I live right in that area, so it's quite fun. They need better, we need better sidewalks, and I know they're building better sidewalks right now on West Avenue, but on Patricia and Braesview definitely need better sidewalks. I've ridden my bike through there a few times, and you take your life into your own hands. I feel bad for the kids, you know.
Yeah, and just a reminder, we will be talking more about sidewalk connectivity and pedestrian areas in subsequent meetings, so don't feel like we're not noticing that. And just so you know, sometimes these focus areas, there may not need to be any land use changes in them. The land use, it may not be about land use, it might be about connectivity, or it might be about streetscape enhancements or something else. So just because, like, if we look at this and say, no, the land use is fine, that doesn't mean it's not a good focus area. It just means land use isn't something we're really looking at. So, okay.
Hey, Carissa,
I just wanted to, I knew we, oh yeah, go ahead.
Pamela has had her hand up, or I just went down, but I wanted to give her a chance.
Okay.
To have her hand up.
Sorry.
I was just going to say that I would like to see, when we're developing these areas, more of a village feel. A lot of those village type mixed use areas with restaurants and then, you know, living areas and small commercial, you know, become regional areas. And I came from Dallas, so I'm thinking of the intersection at Legacy and the Tollway. It started on one of the four corners and it went crazy because people, they have the apartments back from the road, but you don't have the parking lot all the way to the road. You're drawn in to go inside that area and walk around. And it's like it's more of a village feel, although it's gotten quite large in Dallas. But I mean, I think on a smaller scale, it's more like, you know, the Quarry area, especially that new area they built near Trader Joe's to the right when you drive into Trader Joe's there. I mean, something like that that's a little more appealing, that people want to go in, spend time, find nice restaurants, you know, and what have you. And you may have a green space in there usually. And maybe you could uncover some of those hidden streams and stuff.
So we got to close and move on, but I love your point. But the question is always scale. Is something kind of like Artisan's Alley or the Alley what you thought, or does it need to be more intense? Something like the Pearl? Like, are we talking like Artisan's Alley scale, like where it's like
no,
low,
more
or
intense than Artisan Alley? That's very limited. Yeah.
Okay, so not small. You're saying like keep it regional and it's like keep it dense and intense like it is, just more mixed. And less all about the parking in front and more about the character. Okay.
Right.
So our last thing we've got to cover before we move on, does Sunset and Nacogdoches, so down on the map. So I had a question for you guys. So Sunset has kind of already has been redeveloped. It's at like 80% right now. So if we can, for that, if you can kind of just check it and see, do we, you know, is there a change to land use that needs to occur along that corridor? Or is the land use kind of okay? We would like these key focus areas and corridor, like it'd be nice to have some more continuity. It's pretty like patchy now. It'd be nice to make like that whole corridor move from medium purple to light purple or something, you know, like that, where there's a little bit more continuity. Because right now it's pretty patchy. But that's a question for Sunset. Now, Nacogdoches, I think we did just plain run out of time, because I think that warrants an actual conversation. So Jacob, I don't know if y'all talked about Nacogdoches in your last meeting enough. Did I just miss it, or should we save that for meeting number 5?
I think we could probably get to it in meeting number 5 quickly if that's an option. I think we do have some feedback on Nacogdoches, but probably not enough to make like global edits to that area.
Yeah, that's how I feel too, because I think it's really important.
Yeah. Sunset, okay. I think, is an opportunity to talk about connectivity, which would maybe not be so much about land use.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, that's going to be all the time we have to cover the map. I'm going to turn it over to Jacob so he can kind of wrap us up and talk to us a little bit about next steps.
Yeah, so you can go to the next slide. So just, you know, very quickly, I know we're running late here a little bit. The next meeting that's on your agenda is on August 20th. So that's the SHIP housing policy document that the Neighborhood Housing Services has prepared and has been adopted. That's an optional meeting that's happening on the 20th of August, which you should have a calendar invite for that. So do encourage you guys to come to that meeting to learn more about the city's plan for housing. And then the next planning team meeting is September 15th. Beyond that, if you want to chat more about this, definitely reach out to me. Happy to talk to you guys about anything that we discussed today. And I know it can be kind of difficult to get all your thoughts out in the chat, or being compressed with time. So definitely happy to take additional comments. But really with that, that's it. I'll be sending out the meeting summary, and then also the calendar invite for planning team number 6, which is all the way in February. It's the next thing you'll be hearing from me. That's going to be it. Thank you guys for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Jacob.
you all.
Thank you, Ellie. Thank you, Carissa.
Hi, everybody.
Yes, thank you all.